This team has no main damage dealer, but it still deals a ton of damage. Welcome back to another video. My name is Braxophone, and today we're going to be covering the brand new Fridge team that is now achievable with Dendro. As usual, if you like these kinds of videos, you know the drill. Hit like, leave a nice comment, and let's get started. The Fridge team is a super interesting concept. In its simplest form, it's a bloom damage team, a team where you're utilizing Hydro and Dendro to create Dendro cores and defeat enemies with the area damage of bloom. Ordinarily, teams like this wouldn't seem all that effective. You wouldn't be blooming all that often, and by not having any dedicated damage dealers, the team damage would be pretty dang low. However, with the power of knowledge and elemental gauge theory, we can make this team significantly more effective. So let me give you the rundown of why this team works. The Fridge team uses cryo units to freeze enemies that have Dendro on them. That's the overall concept of the team. When they're frozen, they'll have cryo and Dendro aura together. Now, hypothetically, if you applied Hydro to an enemy with Dendro on them, the Dendro aura could be removed from them while spawning a Dendro core, which causes you to have to reapply Dendro and Hydro to spawn another core. However, if an enemy has multiple elements on them, any new elements and reactions go through auras in an order. For example, in an Overload vaporized team, an enemy will have both Electro and Hydro on them at the same time, and you'll apply Pyro to them. If that Pyro isn't strong enough, it will just clean the Electro off of the enemy while leaving the Hydro untouched and not vaporizing. However, if the Pyro gauge is bigger than the Electro gauge, it can get to both elements and cause an overload while also vaporizing the initial hit at the same time. For example, Beto's Burst applies 4 units of Electro, while Guoba from Xiangling applies 1 unit of Pyro. So if Beto used her initial burst hit and the enemy took a hit from Guoba, there would be no vaporize chance because it wouldn't remove the 4 units of Electro, just bring it down. The same thing applies to bloom reactions when you have cryo on an enemy. With a cryo and Dendro aura, when you apply Hydro to an enemy, you can get through the cryo and hit the Dendro just barely enough to bloom, while still leaving the Dendro aura on the enemy so that your next Hydro application can also bloom. Essentially, that means you're going to be getting more blooms for the same amount of Dendro application. Now, one thing about blooms that not everyone is aware of is that only 5 Dendro cores can be on the field at a time. Once a 6th core spawns, the first core to have spawned will immediately blow up for bloom damage. So, with this knowledge, you can freeze enemies in place and force spawn a bunch of Dendro cores due to the extra Dendro aura you have with freezing. It also means that the Hydro character is taking ownership of all of the reactions, since the Hydro being applied is what's going to trigger them. And so for that reason, you can control who is dealing the damage with Elemental Mastery, and that's going to be your Hydro unit. If every Dendro core that you put down blows up for 21,000 damage, you can have over 100,000 damage in bombs sitting on the field at a time. It's a pretty solid chunk of damage, and you're actively spamming the bloom explosions, which hit in an area so multiple targets can be hit at once. And this is why this team doesn't need a damage dealer to work, because the reaction damage is so good on its own. Now, with that being said, just because you don't need a damage dealer doesn't mean the team is better off without one. The variant of this team that I've been talking about uses Kokomi for healing and Hydro, Diona for the C6 Elemental Mastery Share and Freezing, Kazuha for grouping the Dendro cores, and Dendro MC for, well, Dendro. However, you can actually change this team up for a ton more damage. For example, you could replace Diona with Rosaria, Kaya, or Ganyu to increase this team's overall damage. You could also replace the Kazuha I have with someone like Sucrose or Heizo for Elemental Mastery Sharing, or just another cryo unit for more damage. For Kokomi, you could run someone like Xingqiu, Mona, or Child, but for Xingqiu, you still need to give him Sacrificial or Favonius Sword, and for Mona, you won't be getting as many blooms per rotation. If you're not using the Diona version of this, running an Anemo becomes good for both grouping and the Resistance Shred, since it'll buff your cryo character. There's a lot of flexibility in these teams. All you need is good Hydro application, someone to freeze, decent Dendro application, and a flex spot between an Anemo grouper, or just another cryo. One one of the better things about the Fridge team is that it actually lets you use Kale reliably. Kale has a special internal cooldown that makes her apply Dendro slower than the Dendro Traveler, which is not ideal for most Dendro-based teams. But since Fridge maintains the Dendro aura longer, you can reliably slot in Kale and use your Dendro Traveler elsewhere. It's mostly just for players who want to find a reason to use Kale as a Dendro support. Just be aware that in this team, Kale is actually pretty good. So if you like this team, which I do, I think it's really funny, you'll need to know exactly what to build, because this isn't your conventional Genshin team. There are a few main things that you need for this setup. First thing is that you want your character that's going to be proccing blooms to be level 90. This is because all of the Dendro reactions scale with Elemental Mastery, but Elemental Mastery scales with your level. I don't mean you gain more Elemental Mastery based on your level, but I mean that these transformative reactions will increase their damage per Elemental Mastery point based around your character's level as well. Next up is going to be a Hydro character that's going to have a very specific build depending on the character, and also the team that they're in. For example, if you're using Kokomi, you'd want to build her triple Elemental Mastery, and the reason for that is that her damage outside of her burst is already really low, and so investing into that Elemental Mastery can get you higher overall damage output. So with all that in mind, triple EM is the way to go for her. And in her case specifically, you can go for something like the Gilded Dream set, which gives you a bunch of attack and Elemental Mastery based on your party composition. Meanwhile, if you choose to go for someone like Childe or Ayato, things can get kind of weird. If the flex spot in your team is not taken up by a buffer, then Ayato will want to go with triple Elemental Mastery as well, just depending on your artifacts and the content. But with a buffer in your team, like Yunjin for example, you can actually afford to add Hydro damage and crit damage to your lineup because that buffer is going to compensate for the lost attack on the attack sands. You would build EM, Hydro damage, crit. The Bloom damage would look like a lot less, however Ayato's personal damage contribution would be a lot higher. Childe also gets even more complicated because without buffs on Childe, he's in a similar position to Ayato, however he has access to Riptide, which adds a ton of damage in multi-target combat. So with Childe, if you're against a bunch of enemies, it would be better off to just run him with a normal build, with an attack Hydro damage crit build, or if you're running some sort of buffs, then you could also go for Elemental Mastery in the main slot. But overall, in that sort of team, sacrificing your Bloom damage for your Riptide damage would likely be better in multi-target combat. So it is very, very complicated. If you want the easy version of this, just build Elemental Mastery on all 3 slots and call it a day. But if you want to really maximize damage, you're gonna have to take a look at your team comp and the content that you're in to see whether or not the character you're building wants to be built as a main DPS or if they want to be built with triple Elemental Mastery. Also, just remember that if you're playing a character that needs their burst with this, the only 2 that I can think of being Xingqiu or Yelan, you'll need to run an energy recharge weapon like Sacrificial or Favonius in order to actually have your burst up as much as you need. For your Dendro character, you'll want to run them on the new Dendro set, Deepwood Memories, which lowers Dendro resistance. Now don't get too confused on this, the Dendro damage bonus does not increase your reaction damage, but the resistance shred will increase the damage enemies take from your Dendro reactions. Your Dendro characters won't be activating the reactions most of the time, so their reaction damage doesn't matter. Their Elemental Mastery is not as important. You just want to build them like a support. Personally, on both Kale and Dendro MC, I use energy recharge, Dendro damage, and crit rate so I can activate Favonius Sword or Favonius Warbow passive to give me some energy. But really, it doesn't matter how you build them as long as you have an extremely high energy recharge. For example, my Dendro Traveler has about 240% energy recharge, and that is just barely enough to get my burst up on cooldown. Now for the other characters, you can give them a normal build, whatever that may be. If you're using someone like Rosaria, for example, you can give her anything to buff her burst, like Emblem or Noblesse, or just the Blizzard Strayer set to buff her crit rate, since enemies will be frozen. Fridge, though it's slow starting, is one of the highest damage Bloom reaction teams. Obviously, there are going to be teams that outdamage it. It's not the best team by any means, but for Dendro Core based reaction specifically, this team is pretty dang strong. Now, it's not perfect. It suffers from all of the weaknesses that a standard freeze team does, where it's not as effective against bosses, and also it takes quite a bit of setup. So if you use it against something like the Ruin Snake, you're gonna have a really bad time trying to nuke it. And if you don't use energy recharge based weapons, you will have energy issues 100%. And to be quite honest, this team could actually be pretty dang expensive. Xingqiu is one of the most wanted units, and by that I mean he's used by so many different teams, and he's really the only 4-star character that can do this well. So with that in mind, this team is also pretty expensive. It's also just not as good as something like Morgana. This is a team that you play because you want to play Dendro, not necessarily because it's the best team in the world. But overall, it is still really solid and a super fun and cool concept. I think it's pretty dang enjoyable. I think it's funny that in theory you can run this team without a main damage dealer and it still deals pretty solid damage. And I also like that you can add top damage dealers as well. You can use Ayaka or Ganyu in here. You could use Rosaria as well. She's a really solid cryo unit, and that just adds more. Overall, the Fridge team is pretty dang fun. I love it. It's such a silly concept, and it's not a bad team either. If you guys enjoyed this video, or if you are going to be using this team, let me know down in the comments below. Make sure to like the video if you want to show YouTube that it doesn't suck. And if you want to see more content from me, make sure to subscribe to the channel so that way YouTube can let you know whenever I upload. Remember to keep your vegetables in the fridge, and I'll catch you next time.